Hey, good morning, Fannin. Happy Easter to you. Hope you've had a great week. Been an Easter week. We've done a lot of devotionals. Hope you spent some time in the Bible and just some time reflecting on what Jesus had done. So, I've got a quick lesson for you today. I just want to kind of lay the groundwork, some framework for what we're going to be studying. We're moving from Judges in that area into the stories of the Kings in 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. It's kind of like when we used to get together and we'd have breakfast. I'd kind of lay that groundwork, kind of cover the first lesson for us. So that's kind of what I wanted to do today. But I want to go back and revisit something from last week. You know, we were talking about Samson and how a lot of times we just view him as this kind of, party dude, bumbling, kind of moving from one woman to the next, having a good time, kill some Philistines here, kill some there, that kind of comes to a bad ending because he can't keep his mouth shut, and ends up killing a lot of Philistines and actually succeeding at his job, but sheer accidentally almost. But, last week I talked about this idea that a lot of Jewish people look at Samson as more of a freedom fighter, almost like a Robin Hood or a William Wallace type character. And in this sense, and that they look at it as all these things that you can kind of view as Samson just kind of straying from the right path, that in reality it was all a plot. That, getting the Philistine wife, getting his parents to get him that, would endear him and get him in a position where he can have fights with the Philistines himself and kill some of them, because they've done things to him, not to the Jewish people. And the Philistines don't ever really suspect the Jewish people. Matter of fact, the Jewish people a lot of times are suspicious of Samson's behavior. All the way to the very end where he has the opportunity to, by pushing down the temple, kill thousands of them in ways that he hasn't been able to do before. So this idea that even that God put him up to that, God worked with him in that. And some people had texted me and said, or emailed me and said, isn't this kind of deceptive of God? And there's other instances like that in the Bible where God kind of does things and you're like, that doesn't really fit my picture of God. Think about the midwives with Pharaoh. They lied about, delivering the sons, but were rewarded for it. So I'll get to that in a second. So this week I did some thinking about that and praying about it and reading about it. And I found an answer. I'm not saying it's the answer, but it works pretty good for me. And it made me look at the Bible quite a bit differently, actually. So when you think about the Bible, it's obviously the story of God redeeming the world, all the way from calling Abraham to building the Jewish people up, and then to Jesus, and then the apostles taking it on out into the church, into our time. And God using us where we're at, when we're at, to help advance his plan of redeeming mankind in the world. But along with that, there kind of runs this theme of war. I mean, you think about it all the way back in Genesis 3. From the beginning, God's handing out the curses. And, he tells Eve and the snake, I'm going to curse you both. And he tells them, he says, you know what? I'm going to put enmity between your seed, Eve, and the serpent. And eventually, even though the serpent will strike your seed's heel, they will crush his head. So you get this kind of violence from the beginning of a war that's going on, and it carries all the way through the scriptures. I mean, it's easy to see in the Old Testament, but even in the New Testament. Jesus said he came to bring a sword. Look at some of the language that Paul uses when he's talking about how to defeat sin. Put it to death. Fight the good fight. Crucify the flesh. Arm yourselves. Put on the armor of God. And you just see this time and time again, all the way to the book of Revelation, when Jesus wins the final battle. So you have this idea of war that kind of runs through there. And that really changes your perspective of looking at things. Now, let me say something before we get into this too far. This isn't some titanic battle of good and evil. That's kind of a dualistic approach. It's not a level playing field. God is going to win. There's never any doubt about that. Satan and his forces don't stand a chance. They're going to lose. So it's never like something that we're nervous about. Is it going to go? But there is a war. And it's acted out in a spiritual dimension. It's acted out in a physical dimension, both. And we need to realize that. But with that in mind, you begin to see the Bible a little bit differently. So let's look at the midwives in there. So they're supposed to kill the babies when they're born, male babies, and they don't. And Pharaoh comes to them and he says, why aren't you killing these? And they're like, well, these women are such good shape. They have the babies so quick we can't do it. So they're not telling the truth, but they're rewarded. Why, you might say? Well, a couple of things. First thing is, we often misunderstand that commandment. We say that the Ten Commandments say, you shall not lie. But that's not what it really says. It says you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So, as we all probably know, to bear false witness, back then if you could get, one person making a claim against you wasn't enough to stand in court. But if that person brought other people with him that could verify his claim, then you would be punished. You would be found guilty of that. But in a bigger context, we need to remember what the Ten Commandments are all about, right? The first 4 have to deal with a vertical relationship between myself and God. The other 6 have to deal with a horizontal relationship, right, between myself and my neighbor. We're called to love God and love each other. So if I am bringing false records or false stories against someone, I'm not loving my neighbor, right? So it's in that context that lying is bad. So you begin to look at the Hebrew midwives. They're saving lives by doing this. They are not bringing false judgment, right, against their neighbor. They're actually helping their neighbors. Maybe think of it in this context. If you're in World War II, it's the old question. You've got some Jewish people hid in your attic or down in your cellar, and the Nazis come knock on the door. What are you going to do? Are you going to lie to the Nazis? Or are you going to give those people up knowing they're going to certain death? Well, I think in the context, most of us hopefully would lie because we're really showing love for our neighbor by saving them, and we're showing love for life. So suddenly things begin to look a whole lot different if it's a war situation. Because if you're in a war, you don't give away your tactics or your strategies to the enemy. You don't call them up and say, hey, you know what? We're going to pretend to go over here, when in reality we're going to sneak around behind you and conquer you there. You think of Gideon. You think of all these battles that God won kind of through deceptive tactics. And things begin to look a little bit different because that's what we do in war. We come up with strategies and tactics and we keep them to ourselves because we know what the end result needs to be. Now, that doesn't, necessarily give us the right to commit crimes, and there are rules to war, but keeping strategies and tactics. So when you begin to look at what God is doing as, strategies and tactics involved in a war, it puts a whole different slant on things. So just wanted to offer you that. Maybe when you go back, take some time, go back and look at these things, a lot of these incidences that sometimes bother us. In that light, it definitely does make them, look different. So let's move on to the lesson. Like I said, pretty quick. But before we do that, I'll tell you what, we're going to take 1 minute and we are going to discuss this. I just want to know what you think about this. I'm going to let you chat for a minute over there on the site. So, see you in a minute. Okay, so we're back. I couldn't figure out how to get the Jeopardy theme to play while I was off screen, but I was able to get my dog to gnaw on his bone to kind of give you some background noise. So anyhow, excuse me. As we move forward, sorry, allergies just like everybody else. Let's get into the lesson. So Judges left us with a bad taste in our mouth, right? We can see by the end of Judges that the social fabric of Israel had fallen apart. They're now fighting each other. The religious fabric had fallen apart. You got Levitical priests wandering around looking for work, not doing what they're supposed to do. And Israel had found out, like I said last week, that its real enemy was itself. And that they were just on this path to destruction from the inside out. So as you move forward, just a quick word about the Philistines. Now, they were troubled during Samson's time, which I'd said, but that was kind of border skirmishes. The Philistines are going to be the main player as we move forward up until David establishes his kingdom. And why is that? Well, like I said last week, they are a large people group coming down from the north. They have fought the Egyptians in the past. They are a well-organized kingdom with organized military, organized government. They're not like these little city-states that they had fought before. And as a result, they're not going to be beaten off with a couple of battles. They are intending to move down into that area. And it kind of reaches a peak at 1 Samuel 4 when the Israelites lose a major battle against the Philistines, and they're able to, the Philistines kill Eli's sons, and which leads to Eli's death. They were the chief priests. They take the Ark of the Covenant, which we'll get into a little bit more later on, and they really just kind of move in and take over at that point. Almost everything is lost now. The Ark is left. The glory of God has left the country of Israel. So what is it? Well, it's almost like God kind of took all the background stuff out, and the only person left is Samuel, because if you read it, this is where Samuel really steps to the fore. He begins to be the leader that they need. And Samuel is going to defeat them in a number of battles and actually kind of hold back the threat. That and the whole issue with the ark are going to kind of put a pause in the story. The people are unhappy, but Samuel comes along. He's able to lead them in battle, beat back the Philistines. They get the ark back. He becomes a priest, right? He begins to lead them again. He goes around the country judging, and everything's going very well. And Samson, like I said, as on the stage is that last judge. He is the ideal judge in a lot of ways. Now, Deborah was a very good judge, but Samuel is the whole character. He does the religious, he does the leadership in the fighting, and he judges the people. So the only problem is, as it moves to the end of Samuel's life, is that his sons are not worthy successors. And the Jewish people in their minds have given up on God and this idea of a charismatic leader rising up to help them overcome whatever troubles they are having. But they want a continuous leader, not God, but a man. And if Samuel's sons aren't able to do it, then they want a king whose sons will be able to lead them, and grandsons. They have looked at other kingdoms, and they've said, we want what they have. And they've just impatient God. They are after their own needs and wants, and they don't spend time remembering what God had done for them, how he had protected them, how he had even given them the land. They only want that. So, fast forwarding, God's going to give them a kingdom. And he's going to give them a king. He's going to give them a few kings. And things are not going to be what they dreamed of, right? You look at Saul, he falls apart pretty quick. David and Solomon are kind of the peak of it. And then after that, things are going to fall apart for them. We need to remember, just like they should remember, God uses the people that he wants, when he wants, and where he wants them. Remember what God is about, redeeming the world. Now, we'll get into this a little bit more, but the Jewish people forgot that. Look at the people that God uses just in this story. God uses Hannah. Once again, this woman who doesn't even have children. By society's view at that time, she really doesn't have much worth. Now, her husband loves her, and it says he even gives her greater portions of the food, even though she hasn't had a child. But in her eyes, and probably in many of her peers' eyes, she had no worth because she had no child. But God uses her. He uses her faith. He uses her prayer. And, she promises him, like, God, if you will give me this child, I will raise him as a Nazirite. I will give him to the temple when he is old enough to go. And she follows through on that. And actually, God even uses her to kind of reawaken things in Eli, right? When you're looking at Eli, initially, he just sees her and thinks she's some drunk woman. But then once she talks to him and tells him what she's doing, he's enough of a man of God to say, okay, you are truly praying. God will give you what you want. And you look at Eli, and God uses him. Now, his sons are horrible people, and he's allowed them to get that way. You even see a scene where he's trying to do something. He's like the worst ineffectual parent ever. He's like counting to 5, and then they're not doing it, and he's counting to 5 again. And they just don't listen to him. So, yeah, there are bad aspects of Eli. But he's also a man of God. Because also, remember, when Samuel comes and he's living in the temple and God is speaking to Samuel, and Samuel doesn't know who's talking, he goes to Eli. And Eli's enough of a priest and a man of God to say, you know what? that is God talking to you. You need to go back down there. You need to listen. You need to tell God you are listening. And then when God tells Samuel these things, Eli's still enough a man of God to say, you know what? What did he tell you? And even though Samuel doesn't want to say anything, Eli's like, no, you need to tell me, because if it comes from God, I need to hear it. And even though it is a pronouncement of death upon his sons and upon himself, he's like, well, if that's what God wills. So God uses Hannah. He uses Eli, but he also uses the Philistines. This is kind of interesting if you look at it. They are much better at than the Jews at knowing God. And it just shows that this whole scene. So in 1 Samuel 4, they go and they conquer and they wipe out the temple or the tabernacle that's in Shiloh, and they steal the ark. They take the ark back to their country, and once it's there, though, bad things begin to happen, right? First, their god falls over, then his hands are broke off, and then people start to get sick and start to have tumors and all this stuff. So the Philistine priests come together and they're like, something's wrong here. Now, they understand the authority and power of God, because that's what they look at first. And they even say, we need to give glory to the God of Israel, and if we do this, perhaps he will lighten his hand from us. Now, that's more than the Jewish people are saying. They understand. It's interesting how often you see this in the Bible. Somebody that doesn't even worship God, that worships some little gods, understanding the power of God. And what's even more interesting is the Philistines, not the Jews, they remember what God had done to the Egyptians and how he brought the Hebrews out. Just the thing that God constantly told them over in the law, you're to remember, you're to tell your kids about it's like the Philistines did that. Like they heard the Shema and they did that. They're like, hey, don't forget about this God, these guys over here. When we go to fight them, remember, if he gets involved in it, it's not going to go well for us. It's just an interesting picture of that. And then even after, they send the ark back to Israel, that's kind of when Samuel steps in and God begins to use him. And Samuel, like I said, he will be this perfect judge, but he'll also become this prophet figure that we will see as we move forward through the rest of the Old Testament. This person is kind of on the fringe of society that will come in and tell the kings or the people, hey, you're slipping off the path. Things are going wrong. You need to get back to worshiping right. You need to get back to living right. And that is Samuel's role, to be that final judge, kind of the picture of what the perfect judge should be, and then to introduce this prophet and priestly figure that will come on. So God uses all these people throughout these lessons. There's a lot you can go in and read and just study about these people, their faith and how they allowed God to use them. But it's interesting, the Jewish people continue to just not want to act. They continue to want to act like everyone else. But unlike the Philistines, who they kind of want to imitate, they don't remember God. They don't know these things. So what's our walk away? Like I said, pretty short lesson today. I just want to get into this real quick. So I think we need to have patience. That's what the Jewish people did not have. They failed to remember what God had done for them, and they only wanted more. They forgot the fact that everything they had been a gift, that they had walked into a country that was already built, already developed, and they had got all these farms and these, herds of cattle and all this wealth that they now had was strictly because God had run everybody else out for them. But they wanted more, and they were impatient. They didn't want to wait. We want to be like these other guys who have more. We want to be like the Philistines. They forgot the whole point in Leviticus is how to be holy, how to be different. But we always need, when we look at that, we need to ask ourselves, how like that am I? Is that something that even in the midst of all this, when it's, anxiety and there's, fear and all these things, are we concentrating on those things? Are we taking the time to remember what God has given us? I understand there's big picture stuff going on, but there was big picture stuff going on for these guys too. It's interesting. I've seen articles popping up here and there about the apocalypse. Are we living in apocalyptic times? Are we living in end times? And these are secular people who are writing these articles. They're asking big questions like that. We're the ones who should be answering it, but sometimes we're not. Maybe we're so caught up in fear, and we know the ending. They don't necessarily know it. So, be like the Philistines in this sense. Remember who God was and what he is who God is, and what he has done for you. So that's kind of the first thing. We need to wait on things. God's people didn't wait. All they saw was Samuel's children's inability to lead them, and they focused on that. They didn't see all the good things Samuel had done. They only saw what was going to happen next. They only saw these things, and they focused on that. They forgot who their real leader was. They forgot that their real leader was God. They're so busy looking at Samuel's kids and saying, these guys can't lead us. Yeah, we're going to fall apart. Things are going to go, to heck. And they forgot that God was. And they forgot to wait on God after Samuel, because God would have provided. But they didn't want to do that. They wanted a king. They wanted to go their own way. They didn't want to be patient. They didn't want to wait for it. They got a king, but it was Saul who, once he was in place, couldn't wait for it either, right? You think about Saul, he does okay at the beginning. He looks like a king. He's not a very kingly personality or anything, but he does okay. But then when the time comes, when Saul is challenged to wait for it, remember Samuel tells him, go fight these guys, go wait here with the sacrifice. Don't do the sacrifice. Wait till I show up. Now Samuel was late. I think he was like a week late, but Saul should have waited, and he didn't. And when he does the sacrifice, that's it. That's the end of his throne. That's the end of his dynasty. Everything else will end in ruin. So sometimes God makes us wait longer than we want to. We're very impatient. I mean, you can look here and see, it's not like Solomon will eventually say, there's nothing new under the sun. We're very, very impatient. And then I think during these times, we need to be careful what we ask for, right? Because God will, if we continue to ask him, just like he did the Jews, God will allow us to pursue people and things that aren't good for us, that are bad for us. But he will eventually allow us to do that, just like he did them. And then look at the troubles that it brought. Just like we've all probably done this. Gone after something or someone that we knew we shouldn't. And then when we got it, number one, we get the empty feeling, but it really wasn't everything we made it out to be. And number two, it usually brings despair and sadness. So, don't forget that we're at war. Okay, that's my message to you. As you go through this, as you think about this during church, they killed Jesus because he didn't forget they were at war, because they hated that much. So don't forget that this is a war that we're involved in, and we are to be patient. We're to wait on God. Hope to see you here in a little bit, over at the service. Wave at everybody. Once again, 11 o'clock, 98.3 on your FM dial. Bring your Lord's Supper stuff, and we'll see you here in a little bit. Clean your windshield so we can all get a good look at you. Hey, we love you, and we're excited about this morning. We hope to see you there, Lord. And it's going to be a good day. Thanks. Bye.